It's totally unacceptable to have a person who cannot afford 100 rand bail, but it's costing the taxpayer 400 rand a day to be in our facilities. We cannot afford that a person who comes to our facilities for a minor offense go out of the facilities a hardened criminal. It cannot be tolerated. We cannot allow that, because then we disserve South Africa and its people. We deal with the most dangerous people in South Africa. If the time to start is 7:15, you don't go to job or to your work at 10 o'clock. Why do you wait till 10 o'clock? If you have to report at 7:15, ensure that you're punctual. That is the way it should be. I'm used, when I worked in a factory, we had a clocking machine. If you were 1 minute late, by the end of that month, you get 1 minute's less payment. That's the environment I worked before I became a member of parliament. Now, there are some people that think that you have the right to have a job. No, you don't have a right. It's a privilege to have a job today in South Africa. If you look at our unemployment rate. Well, here that I put very much emphasis. And I want to start to say, why are we correctional services? What does that mean? It means that we deliver a service. To who do we deliver that service? To the people of South Africa. The Commissioner has referred to it, saying that we are here to serve South Africa. So we must say to each other that it is not about a political party. Yes, I am the leader of the Freedom Front Plus, but I also do understand that when we talk about correctional services, it is a service to all the people in South Africa. That we must always remember. And I want to start to share with you my views, my priorities. I've already shared it with the National Commissioner, that if I do not share it with you, then we cannot be successful. You must also know, how do we see the future in terms of correctional services? Because we can only have success if we take hands. It's not only for a minister on its own, or a deputy minister, or a national commissioner that can obtain these goals on their own. We can only obtain the goals if we take hands. Now, where do we start? I said one very important matter is corruption. Not only in correctional services, all over the country. There's, as far as I'm concerned, no one department that does not have corruption in their midst. And we must ensure that there is zero tolerance when it comes to corruption. There's no doubt in my mind that far the majority of the employees of correctional services are hardworking, honest people with integrity, because that's what we need for the future to save South Africa. Integrity, hardworking, and we must build that trust. And all of us must ensure that we get rid of the bad apples, because it's the bad apples that is actually also giving all of us a bad name. We cannot allow impunity. There must be consequence management. And we must take hands. We must ensure that we become proud. How do you become proud? You become proud when, for instance, if you walk in the street and you wear your uniform, that the people of South Africa will come to you and say, wow, you're from correctional services. Look at your attitude. And I've watched when the national anthem was sung. help certain people stand at attention. Make sure that the way you act is a way of proudness, a way to say that I'm here to serve. Because that actually reflects your attitude. And I've used the expression in Afrikaans, I said, dit is die klein jakkalsies wat die wingerde verwoes. What does that mean? Yeah, that actually means that you may think it's some insignificant sort of incidents that not really matters. But that's where we make our mistake. It is those things that we think is insignificant that can bring change. I want to bring back to our facilities a competition to see which facility, in terms of certain categories, have the best and the most beautiful garden. That is what we must do. If you visit your facility, you must be proud to say, wow, look at our garden. It's beautiful. And I'm already in certain discussions with certain companies, no names, no pectoral at the moment, to sponsor us with those sort of competitions so that we can make our people proud. That is what it is. But when we talk about to be proud, I, as minister, when I walk in the streets and I see members in uniform, I also want to feel proud. And vice versa. If you see me walking in the streets, I am sure that you also want to say, well, look at the attitude. Look the way he walks. He is proud, and that will make you proud. So it's one hand washes the other hand. That is what we must say to each other. We must uplift the morale of our people. And yes, we will attend to certain issues. I am informed that not all our employees are issued with a uniform. I know that some of them have uniforms, but they were not issued with the correct shoes. It's a klein jakkalsie. Shoes, a klein jakkalsie. But we must ensure that those uniforms, full uniforms, are available to our people. That's our obligation. We must look at all our employees to ensure that they are working in conditions in such a manner that they will be happy employees. And why do I say that? Correctional services is quite different from all the other departments. It's easy to be with Home Affairs or the National Affairs, but we deal with the most dangerous people in South Africa. The other day I said at the meeting where the president was present, and we spoke about the criminal justice system, because we must look at the criminal justice system in South Africa, because our people, law-abiding citizens, are more and more becoming victims of crime. And there are certain plans, and I said, yes, I listen to what all my colleagues say, and we must improve it. My only problem is that it's a bit of a contradiction for me, because in the end, my department or my ministry will deal with all the results of a better criminal justice system. And I am aware of the circumstances under which some of our people really work, which are really dangerous. I understand that. So I want to say to you, the most important asset for correctional services are you, the employees. And the success will depend on all of us. Another priority is we will have to look at self-sufficiency. And I know there are some people, yeah, very glad to hear that. We will have to expand. Yes, we have bakeries. We produce food. We have workshops. My furniture in head office is completely manufactured by correctional services. We are in the process where we can get other state departments to say, don't go to the private sector, come to correctional services. We can give it for a cheaper price, with sometimes higher quality and better furniture. So that is what we must look at. So that is a priority. And I see these projects of self-sufficiency also as part of rehabilitation. I'm very fond of gardening. I hear the National Commissioner is also very fond of gardening, so maybe you understand why you're going to have a competition. But my experience is, if you get an inmate that puts something in the ground, look at it, ensure that there's water, and see that there's coming out of the ground something. It's growing. In the end, it is produced as food in one of our facilities. That will give some new meaning in life. Therefore, rehabilitation is also a priority. I always say to people, say for instance you have a prisoner who received a 10-year sentence. After 10 years, that prisoner is going back into our society, whether you will like it or not. I think there's some confusion among some people of the public. They think we are the Justice Department because they want us to change the sentences. We cannot. After 10 years, that person is going back. And therefore, we have the responsibility to ensure that there is proper integration when it comes to that. I also want to say that we will have to look at the overcrowding of our facilities. I already started to have talks with other departments. We will have to look at the reform of the sentencing process in South Africa. I mean, it's totally unacceptable to have a person who cannot afford 100 rand bail, but it's costing the taxpayer 400 rand a day to be in our facilities. We cannot afford that a person who comes to our facilities for a minor offense go out of the facilities a hardened criminal. It cannot be tolerated. We cannot allow that, because then we disserve South Africa and its people. And therefore, these matters are very important. And I share it with you so that you can understand how I see the future. I know, normally, ministers are only there for 5 years, then there's change. It is in the hands of the president. The president can, after maybe you heard this speech, said, I disagree with you and I think I'm going to replace you. But I don't think he will do it. So because we are on the same page. Therefore, from my side, please come forward if you have problems. Talk. And by that, I don't mean that you can bypass your managers. And together we can solve the problem. Of course, there will some problems we will not be able to solve immediately. And I said many times, the solutions, when it comes to that, there are no quick fixes. It's not a quick fix. We must say to each other, yes, there's an elephant in the room. Corruption. all that sort of things. And how do we eat the elephant? You eat it piece by piece. And in the end, we will win by eating that elephant. Maybe not in my time, but when I'm looking back, or when I'm going to look back, I want to say at least we tried, we have ensured that the principles are there. We ensure that the foundation has been set. And we are lucky. Some of those foundations are there already. Not new because I'm a new minister, but because of the department's hard work. Hard work of the National Commissioner and you as the team. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We look at those principles, and they are good principles. But we must ensure that we expand on that. I've mentioned, for instance, self-sufficiency, our farms. I've already been contacted by various organizations to see how we can expand it. Get private partners. Part of the priorities from the government of national unity is to say that we have an obligation. The results of the election set, whoever the government is going to be, we now are the government of national unity. We want to create a better South Africa. And how do you create it? The number one priority is to ensure that the economy grow, so that we can ensure that we employ more and more people. And that brings me to the situation where you are an employee. Now, there are some people that think that you have the right to have a job. No, you don't have a right. It's a privilege to have a job today in South Africa, if you look at our unemployment rates. And you will hear that I put very much emphasis on to feel proud. How can a person who must provide for his or her family be proud if they don't have a job? No. And that's part why we get more and more people in our facilities. And now we are part of building that economy. Because the moment the world and business people see but correctional services are there to stamp out corruption, that they are proud, people with enthusiasm to work for a better future, they will invest more in South Africa. So don't think that correctional services does not play a role in building and enhancing the economic growth in South Africa. Each and every department must play their role, and we will play our role. So from my side, as I said, let's take hands, let's work hard. If the time to start is 7:15, you don't go to job or to your work at 10 o'clock. Why not? Why do you wait till 10 o'clock? If you have to report at 7:15, ensure that you're punctual. That is the way it should be, because that also reflects your attitude towards your job. I mean, I'm used, when I worked in a factory, we had a clocking machine. If you were 1 minute late, by the end of that month, you get 1 minute's less payment. That's the environment I worked before I became a member of parliament. So I don't say these things to say that these are all the mistakes. I say these things to show to you, I'm not blind when it comes to the klein jakkalsies. We must address those klein jakkalsies. And if my message for this afternoon can stick with you in terms of we are here to serve, we must be proud to serve, and we will deal with those klein jakkalsies. Then we will become winners for correctional services. I thank you very much.
Yeah, brilliant speech, guys. What do you think? I really started thinking about the importance of Dr. Pieter Groenewald's task as Minister of Correctional Services after stumbling on some really scary, disturbing facts about, the prison system in South Africa. And many times I've always wondered, being an outsider, I always speak about how the outsider perspective is usually mostly appreciated in ways that, we really cannot understand because not being South African and not necessarily having an internal understanding of the systems in South Africa, coming from research, I think there are many things that I might be able to see from a perspective that it's a little bit of a bird's eye view that might differ from what many of you who live in South Africa actually are able to see and understand. But both views are actually important in trying to gain a robust understanding of, the issues we discuss here on Kwazemi, especially as regards democracy and governance in South Africa. So it was really interesting for me to understand the fact that, it says that South Africa has 243 correctional centers, which is like a prison, okay? And a total inmate population in South Africa of 161,054 inmates totally, you see. And so this was a research that was conducted in 2017. And actually, this is about 5 years now, but it actually gives an overview of, the capacity South Africa has to be able to contain criminals and manage the prison system in South Africa, which, many times I've always wondered, if the level of anger we see in South African society probably stems from the apartheid era, or probably the history of South Africa, which has actually been a very violent one, and that anger still remains within the system and probably is now being, manifesting as different forms of crime. The anger in the hearts of many people who have suffered different forms of traumas, different families that actually suffer traumas. You see, so this is one. Prognosis I personally have for the reason why there's a lot of crime, violence, and in South Africa. So the idea of the fact that, there are 243 prisons and 161 inmates, 161,000 inmates as at 2017 is actually speaks of a lot, and it says that there are also 43,646 remand detainees. So these are people who are actually awaiting trial or sentencing. And so the vast majority of the sentenced and unsentenced inmates in South Africa, in all this number, they're actually 97.5% male. So this kind of gives reason for, the idea I spoke about, how the violence, the trauma and all that probably is actually having much more to do with the males. And you see, like I spoke about a lot. I think I'll be doing a video on that on Gaten Mackenzie's interview with Mark G. He spoke about growing up. He was usually an angry youth, and in the time, growing up as a colored male in the time, or probably a black male in South Africa, violence was actually the norm in a way. Even if you listen to the interview of I think his name is Sylvester. I think he's one of the South Africans that actually escaped jail multiple times. I think it's Sylvester Moko. I'll just quickly try to get that. I think he had a really interesting interview recently on a YouTube channel. Moko Feng, right? Sylvester Moko. Yes, Mofokeng. Sylvester Mufokeng. He's actually he had a really interesting interview on YouTube recently. I think on the channel called a Scheme GP. Really interesting. I enjoyed the interview so much because he spoke a lot about how, the character of South Africa, right, and what in the society of South Africa makes the breeding of a hardened criminal possible. You see, really touching. He actually now He's looking for ways to really get into schools to motivate the youngsters, on the dangers of crime and all that. Really touching interview, but really enlightening, because he spoke about a lot of, the correctional system during the apartheid periods, and his escape, and he has a really graphic storytelling perspective to the whole thing. And when you really listen to his story, you're able to capture the reality of apartheid South Africa at the time, and some of the things that probably the history books didn't tell us or haven't explained in visual terms, as much as he's able to capture his own personal story and his escape from prisons during the time, and the life in prison with the Afrikaners, and his relationship between the Afrikaners and the blacks at the time. Really, really, really interesting and touching story. So for me, it was really interesting anyway to get into that point, to really understand the character of South Africa from that perspective, and knowing fully well that now we know that 97.5% of inmates in South Africa, both those that have actually been sentenced and unsentenced, are 97.5% male. That's really shocking. But one other interesting part, and I think this is where Dr. Groenewald's task as Minister of Correctional Services is really sensitive, is the fact that the prisons now have become breeding grounds for, different forms of diseases, tuberculosis, and even HIV. I think the research actually proves that, the prevalence of HIV in South Africa, right, in the prison population alone is actually 15.6%, which is 3 times higher, than the general population. So it appears that the prison system in South Africa now happens to represent a breeding ground for diseases like HIV and, tuberculosis and all that. You see, and this is as a result, according to this research, of the overcrowding. There's so much overcrowding. Here it speaks about poor ventilation. It speaks about inadequate ablution facilities. So I think this is for the Muslim, inmates who desire to pray as prisoners. They are really poor. Those poor facilities in there. There's a lack of sanitation and privacy. He actually accused that there's a shortage of beds and bedding. There's an insufficient supervision and oversight, and also poor healthcare provision. And probably the insufficient supervision could actually also explain the anger I saw, in many of your comments on, I think I made a video, but also this video that actually had the prisoners in South Africa speak about how, they were enjoying life in the prison and all that. It might actually boil down to this lack of supervision, probably a lack of staff, or maybe just lack of supervision generally of the prisoners in South Africa, that actually made, South African prison become kind of like sort of like a haven for many people, or, people who will soon be, sentenced to those cells. He also speaks about, and the most brutal part of it, and the last video I shared with Gaten McKenzie, where he spoke about his story of when I think a 13, 14-year-old, white boy got into the prison and was raped by some of the gangs. So rape in prisons actually now represents another really terrible aspect of prison life in South Africa. It argues here that, consequence of, prisons in South Africa have become a hotbed for sexual violence and disease transmission, including the HIV. So the HIV virus that actually seems to be breeding out of prisons, sort of like is really attached to incidences of sexual offenses and sexual violence. And then it also explains why there's a lot of sexual violence also in society, because I saw a really interesting point here that actually argues that, most of the, I think we'll just go through it really interesting, because it's a really interesting point to really understand, South Africa, some of the issues in South Africa, especially from the perspective of violence, and how, why it's important for us to care, and why we should understand, and how we could actually see the importance of the duty of the Minister of Correctional Services in South Africa. So it argues that research has actually shown that sexual violence is actually pervasive in South Africa's prisons, and it's really underreported. Okay, so it says that it is not it's not only a grave human rights violation, but it's also considered by the United Nations rapporteur on torture and cruel and inhuman degrading treatment or punishments. It's amounts to torture. All right, so and it's also a driver of HIV. We see so correctional centers in South Africa now, they have a really high HIV prevalence, partly owing to the heightened vulnerability of the communities from which majority of inmates come. Now, with the overcrowding, which I mentioned earlier, the poor sanitation, the poor nutrition, the inadequate medical care, and a culture of toxic masculinity in the prisons, South African prisons have become environments conducive for both the transmission of HIV as well as a rapid progression to illness and even death. Okay, so even in the prisons, when most of these guys are actually tortured by rape in prisons, many actually end up, this speed with which the transition from the illness to death, even in the prison, actually can occur because of what the whole spread. And there are some really interesting parts. So it says, owing to the severe overcrowding in South African prisons, it is difficult to separate the predatorial detainees from sexually vulnerable detainees, okay, making it harder to prevent sexual violence in prison. So this is actually why the job of Dr. Pieter Groenewald is really sensitive, really important, because sexual violence is also another thing that correctional services would actually need to intervene in. I think, the last ministers have not been able to attend to that because it's a really tricky divide on how to really detect sexual violence going on in prisons, you see. So it says that this problem is actually exacerbated by staff shortages. And if you listen to this video, you see that Dr. Pieter Groenewald actually argues, and he actually speaks to these employees that, it is not their right. It's not a right in South Africa of today to have a job. It's a privilege because, South Africa has, I think, 33% unemployment rate. And so having a job now today in South Africa is actually, according to him, a privilege. But in spite of this, there's still a shortage of staff that the society is capable to carry. And this is actually why one of the reasons I suspect that Herman Mashaba's Action Essay really blasted President Ramaphosa for the large cabinet, because he argued that, if the cabinet could be reduced, some of those funds could actually be, spread into some of these other areas. Like, for example, correctional services, the shortage of staff is a really tricky one, especially if South Africa, this research shows that South Africa has a total of 161,000 approximately inmates, an extra 43,000 that have not been sentenced. So it's a really tricky, ministry to not to have sufficient staff, okay? Now, it also argues that the problem is also exacerbated due to inadequate shift systems, right? Which leaves inmates unmonitored for hours of the time and locked up for longer periods of time, and also and limits to their access to development and rehabilitative programs, healthcare, and psychosocial support services in prison. So these are actually some of the the weaknesses or the threats that result from a lack of adequate employees in correctional services in South Africa. So as a result of this lack of, supervision and all that, sexual violence now has become that haven, so to speak, that bedrock that has served as a reason for the increased risk of transmission of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases in the prison. So it argues here that although notwithstanding the physical or infrastructural contributors to sexual violence, another factor to consider is the perpetuation of gendered constructs and the culture of hegemonic masculinity, within prison. So many rapes in prisons now in South Africa, according to this research, actually reflect. It says that it reinforces men's understandings, right, of an expression of male dominance, and is then used as a tool for hierarchical aspiration. So in the prisons, for example, this whole expression of what it means to be a dominant alpha male in the prison systems, you see, then becomes a bedrock to drive this ideology. So it's a really sick meta derivative of what ideology of dominance of a male represents in the prisons, in that it must engage or and indulge in these acts of sexual violence to be able to prove or ascertain a certain dominance, or maybe a gang, for example, or groups of gangs, to ascertain their dominance above other men. And as a result, this research actually shows that, many of the victims of these, sexual acts of sexual violence, this is how sexual violence in society in South Africa then reproduces itself. And I think it would be really important for us to capture this. It says that these notions also contribute to the continued perpetration of sexual violence in the general population, even after their release. So men who are admitted to prison for crimes other than sexual offenses may then become both traumatized and desensitized to sexual violence in prison as a result of experiencing or witnessing sexual assault. So in turn, these men then become perpetrators of rape or sexual violence. So we see how the cycle then continues even upon their release. Those who were victims and those who witnessed sexual violence in prisons, upon release, end up seeming to have captured a certain form of a certain habit. They still retain this idea of dominance, among males, to the point where even upon release, that ideology, that mental model, that mental state that actually defines the essence of what their male dominance should represent, then perpetuates into crimes in society, thereby elongating the process and sequence of sexual violence in society to what South Africa has been today called the murder capital of the world. And the murder capital, according to Neil de Beer, speaks about how South Africa has 82 murders a day, which can be likened to a war, although South Africa is not in a war. But at the same time, some of those murders result from sexual violence, as a result of, homicide. Some of the victims of sexual violence have actually committed suicides because they couldn't, bear the continuation of their lives. Many actually still live in trauma. Many are actually experiencing massive depression that have now led to them being even unemployable. You see, so unemployment doesn't necessarily even now in this situation doesn't have to be as a result of a lack of skills or lack of resources, but some people are not just able to see themselves unemployable anymore as a result of incidents that have actually happened during their lifespan. And these things stem from incidences at the correctional centers. And so you see the importance of a correctional services in South Africa. It's a really huge task, and one that probably we really would be hoping that Dr. Pieter Groenewald is actually capable of managing, because it's so sensitive and so important in society to keep the society safe and begin this process of converting South Africa into a safe haven once more from the murder capital it has been decreed to the taking over from Nayib Bukele's El Salvador, who is now actually claiming that his country has become the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. South Africa can actually do that, but I think that a lot of work would have to begin from the prisons, and this takes a much more, I would suspect, a much more rugged outlook. You see, so when Gayton McKenzie spoke about how he wants to work as a minister of police and or probably home affairs, his perspective was to try to ascertain and really reduce these problems from the perspective of the crime and the gangs and all that, him being sort of like involved in this whole gang cycle previously, prior to his now becoming what he is today. But it is really hopeful, and that Dr. Pieter Groenewald is able to really grasp and address this issue. But one of the things that I suspect would be limiting this ministry will be the finances and the funding, because there needs to be now more staff, more employees, and not just any kind of employees, but employees that understand the psychology of these ideologies that then drive what perpetuates and reproduces these crimes, both in prisons and out of prisons, so that there can be a tactful approach to solving these issues and carrying out daily tasks within the correctional center. So I think for me, this was a really powerful speech by Dr. Pieter Groenewald. I really learned a lot, the importance of a correctional center. Coming from West Africa, coming from Nigeria, we know a lot about the prison systems. The prison systems are also really poor. Many testimonies of many people who have been released from those prisons give really harrowing stories of what goes on in those centers and these correctional facilities. Probably it's designed not to be comfortable, and hoped it to have these people have a rethink on their worldviews and how they see the world. But then in South Africa, it appears like Dr. Pieter Groenewald argues that it seems that somebody who was a less hardened criminal, or somebody who was, sentenced as a less hardened person, in South Africa, upon leaving the prison, becomes a hardened criminal. So in other words, South African prisons sort of now become a hardening tool that then produces criminals. Rather than reforming the minds of criminals, it then produces much more hardened criminals, thus increasing the the level of violence and the level of toxicity in society in South Africa. So it's a really important, I think, ministry, and we're really hoping that Dr. Pieter Groenewald would, do his best. I'll be analyzing most of his speeches, some reports, and the improvements that maybe, we'll be observing as we observe this government of national unity from the perspective of correctional services. But anyway, what do you guys think about his speech here? Really interesting for me anyway. I don't know about you, but share your thoughts. Share your thoughts in the comments.